Mr. President, we're now well on our way to confirming Judge Gorsuch as the next Justice of the Supreme Court. Now, I have a few things to say about the way that we've gotten here. Earlier today, the other side, meaning the Democrats, made a very unprecedented break with Senate history and with Senate tradition. They launched the first partisan filibuster of a Supreme Court nominee in our nation's history. For our part, we Republicans insisted that we follow the practice of the Senate. We don't engage in partisan filibusters of Supreme Court nominees. Yesterday, I came to the floor to speak about the path that brought us to this point. As I discussed way back in 2001, referring to the year 2001, the current minority leader and some of his allies on the far left hatched a plan to, in their words, change the ground rules with regard to lower court nominees. I noted a New York Times article describing the Democrat Senatorial Caucus retreat where the new approach to nominees was discussed. In other words, where they discussed the strategy for changing the ground rules of how judges are considered by the United States Senate. And so, Mr. President, I want to put that in the record. May 1st, 2001, New York Times article entitled "Washington Talks, Democrats Readying for a Judicial Fight."
Without objection.
Thank you. After a brief time in the majority, Senate Democrats were back in the minority in 2003. So approximately 2 years after they had this strategy. It was at that time the Senate Democrats began an unprecedented and systematic filibusters of President George W. Bush's circuit court nominees. Then the tables turned. President Obama was elected, and Republicans held the Senate minority. At that time, even though many of us didn't like the idea of using the filibuster on judicial nominees, we also recognized that we couldn't have two sets of rules, one for Republican presidents and one for Democrat presidents. Our party defeated two nominees for the lower courts by filibuster and denied cloture to three of President Obama's nominees to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. But the other side didn't appreciate being subjected to the rules that they first established, started using in 2003 to filibuster judges. So at that point, in 2013, they decided to change the rules of the United States Senate. And by the way, they changed the rules by breaking the rules. And I say that because the rules of the Senate say it takes 2/3 vote to change the rules of the Senate. But they changed it by a majority vote. Now, at that time, as we all know, Majority Leader Reid changed the rules for all cabinet nominations and lower court nominees. To say that my colleagues and I were disappointed is a gross understatement. The majority claimed that they left intact the filibuster for Supreme Court nominees. But my view back in 2013 when they did that was that the distinction Majority Leader Reid drew between lower court nominees and Supreme Court nominees wasn't a meaningful one. My view in 2013 was that Majority Leader Reid had effectively eliminated the filibuster for both lower court nominees and the Supreme Court. And here's the reason. There are two circumstances where this issue might conceivably arise. Either you have a Democrat in the White House and a Democrat-controlled Senate, or where you would have a Republican in the White House and a Republican-led Senate. In the first, there's a Democrat in the White House, and the party led by Leader Reid and Leader-in-Waiting Schumer was in the majority. And if, for some extraordinary reason, Senate Republicans chose to filibuster the nominee, there's no question that a Majority Leader Reid or a Majority Leader Schumer would change the rules. Now, I don't believe that this particular circumstance would ever arise because our side doesn't believe in filibustering Supreme Court nominees. I've never voted to filibuster a Supreme Court nominee, not once. And I think I have a pretty good sense of the rest of our caucus. Our side just doesn't believe in it. It's not much more complicated than that simple common sense statement I just made. And of course, even if, for some extraordinary reason, our side did choose to filibuster a Supreme Court nominee, we don't have to speculate as to whether the other side would have changed the precedent with respect to the Supreme Court. Last year, when everyone thought that Secretary Clinton was going to win the election, their own vice presidential candidate said that they would change the rules if they needed to, if we had a Republican filibuster. Then, of course, the other circumstance where this issue would arise is what we have, what you've seen this very day. A Republican in the White House and a Republican-controlled Senate. And we saw this very day, the minority was willing to take that last step and engage in the first partisan filibuster in U.S. history. And as I've repeatedly discussed, because they were willing to do it with a nominee as well qualified as Judge Gorsuch, it proved without a shadow of a doubt that they'd filibuster anyone submitted by this Republican president. That's why on the day that Majority Leader Reid took that unprecedented action in 2013 to break the Senate rules, to change the Senate rules, I spoke on the floor and I concluded my remarks this way. So I want to quote myself, quote, "So the majority has chosen to take us down this path. The silver lining is that there will come a day when the roles are reversed. When that happens, our side will likely nominate and confirm lower court and Supreme Court nominees with 51 votes, regardless of whether the Democrats actually buy into this fanciful notion that they can demolish the filibuster on the lower court nominees and still preserve it for the Supreme Court nominees." End of my quote from November 2013 when Leader Reid took that extraordinary step. So though I'm extremely pleased that we'll confirm such an exceptional nominee to the Supreme Court in the next day or so, I'm of course disappointed with what we were forced to do to get it done. And sadly, I can't say I'm surprised. And I think my surprise, or the fact that I can't be surprised, You can tell it from what I said back there, what I just quoted from 2013 speech that I gave. I knew when Majority Leader Reid did it in 2013 that this is where we were headed, and that's where we ended earlier this afternoon. But the bottom line is that you can't have two sets of rules. You can't clothe yourself in the tradition of a filibuster while simultaneously conducting the very first partisan filibuster of a Supreme Court nominee in history. You can't demand a rules change only when it suits the Democrat members of this body. You just can't have it both ways. You can't use the Senate rules as both a shield and a sword. But I must say, the one thing that doesn't disappoint me is this. The nominee to take Justice Scalia's seat is eminently qualified. He will apply the law faithfully, without respect to persons. He's a judge's judge. And come sometime tomorrow, we'll all start calling him Justice Gorsuch.